I'ma make a toast, cause we still alive. No big, I feel like Pac. I shoot a shot. I'm coming in hot.
Okay guys, summer is just around the corner and a lot of you are going to be trying to combat the temperatures, as I have many times in the past. Now in this little tutorial, I am gonna cite some studies. Most of those studies have been done on humans, so they haven't been done specifically on dogs. But as we know, a lot of the research money goes into human beings and they are mammals. So whether or not you want to assume that the same goes for a dog is totally up to you. Anecdotally, I've found that a lot of the research is super beneficial and does hold true with my dog. One thing experts seem to agree across the board on is that the number one factor into preparing your dog for any sort of environment is training in that environment. But we're going to talk about a couple of the ways that you can do that. The first is considered active preparation, and the second would be considered passive preparation. The passive preparation might just be having your dog in that environment but not working. That's considered the inferior of the two. So for those of you who live in condos and your dog has to stay inside or you can't leave your dog outside, that's good news, because the research has shown that's actually not the biggest factor into preparing your dog. The biggest factor is working them in that environment. And you'll see in some of these graphics that there's a way to do it recommended by OSHA that includes starting with like a 20% and then upping to 30% the second day, and a staggered work schedule within the heat. So starting really small, a fraction of what you would do in your normal sessions so that you don't risk overheating your dog, which does cause damage, and gradually building up. The other thing most experts agree on is that it takes approximately 2 weeks to acclimate. Now there are some caveats here. So for the dogs who have had a head start, let's say you went to an environment, you drove south, you trained for a couple weeks, and then you drove back to your house, which is more in the cold, and you were there for a month, and then you returned. Those humans had a little bit of an advantage. So if you've done some sort of pre-acclimation work, that's gonna help your dog acclimate faster. But all in all, you need about 2 weeks of acclimation. I made a huge mistake. My dog's, one of my dog's first threes, where I came down from Ontario, Canada in the winter time and trialed in Tennessee. I was supposed to get there 2 weeks before, but my transmission went out. I still decided that, screw it, my dog will be fine. He was so exhausted. He had not been training. So the other big factor is make sure your dog is doing the activity they're going to do. So protection for a lot of dogs is the height of that emotion. And if you haven't been doing protection and then you try to go do a trial, that's going to be a little bit tough. So try to do the activity you're going to do and try to do it in the middle of the day. So even if you're not in temperatures that are going to replicate where you're trialing, at least try to do your activity at the absolute heat of the day where you are. So if you do have a trial that has a lot of projected heat and you live in a really cold environment, I personally would not do the trial unless I can get there at least 2 weeks before to prep my dog. Now there is another way that athletes use to prepare themselves, and that's by using chambers of some sort to replicate that. So for example, this room I'm filming in has a little self heater in it. I can set up my dog pacer in here, crank up the heat, and make sure that he gets sprinted and worked out in that heat regularly. And that does help. Athletes across the board do use this. So be sure that you're considering all of your options, especially if you're not able to do that traveling so far in advance. Don't underestimate just going for a leash walk for an hour and a half, 2 hours in the middle of the day. That's gonna, especially for the older dogs, it's gonna avoid injury. It's gonna help them acclimate. They're still gonna be working hard, especially if you're going for a hike. Having them on a leash makes sure they individually use each leg instead of being able to offload while they're running. The other huge factor that experts across the board agree on is that hydration before, during, and after any activity is massive in preventing any sort of heat issues. Interestingly enough, milk has shown in research to retain hydration more than water. It has to do with the sugar that's in it, the protein that's in it. I've attached a little link for that paper. And I've been feeding my dog milk actually for quite a while. Again, we don't know if it translates to dogs, but it's great to bait the water with it. So you can use powdered goat's milk, or you can even just use regular milk from the store. but your dog is going to want to drink it more. So they're going to drink more of it. And anything that you can get your dog to drink more of course, that doesn't have like a high salt content, and make sure that we're hydrating prior to the trial, during the trial, after the trial, is going to be important to retaining that hydration and keeping them as hydrated as possible. You can get as creative as you want with this. Maybe take an ice tray and fill it with milk or goat's milk and have the dog eating that a half an hour before they go on. Not a lot, but a few ice cubes, because the other research has shown in athletes who drink frozen liquids, it helps to kind of air condition their insides. So we're going to talk about the 3 ways that you can cool down your dog kind of day of. And that's the second way. It's the second most effective way to keep an athlete cool, is by drinking frozen drinks, not just cold water. So like right before I go out to do my track, I make sure that I have ice water with me, or whatever I'm going to give him, that it's iced, and I'll feed him that right before he actually even does his track. Another thing to consider is food. Now, a while back, a friend of mine, Aaron O'Shea, actually sent me an article, and I can't find it, that Lackland Air Force did on food consumption and how close to work would be as a detriment to the dog. So sorry, I worded that a little weird. So essentially what they found was that dogs work the best when they had a 24-hour period of no food. That's not always possible. It's certainly not possible for me, because I kind of dabbled with it a little bit. But what I found is that feeding him anything that has that's less processed, he seems to need less water. So I'm assuming he's keeping more hydration. So if you feed kibble, obviously that's going to displace a lot of hydration. It's going to go into the kibble and expand. So I'd make an effort to try to feed non-processed food at least a couple weeks in advance if possible. So that can be raw food. I also use something called air-dried meat. I'll give you guys a link here. I know for myself, when I eat unprocessed food, I definitely feel more active. I feel more alert. So I'm just assuming the same is going to go for the dogs. The other thing I try to do is feed some sort of glucose supplement. That could be white rice, or what I like to use is called Glycoflex. Again, I'll post a link here. And that's a post-workout replacement that has to be fed within like 20 to 30 minutes, I think. So I do use that, especially in the couple weeks before the trial. I don't use that regularly. I stick to things like milk or goat's milk to keep them hydrated. But during the weeks where we're trial prepping, where things are maybe a little more hardcore, maybe the month before the trial even, especially if it's hot, I will use this Glycoflex. All right, so now let's start with the day of trial prep, trying to pre-cool. Now, before I go into the methods I use and the reasons why I use them, I want to be sure you understand that I do a lot of massage with my dog. I do both hand massage, and I use an actual massager from, I think it's called Theragun. And I do this to keep my dog really, really loose. I do it regularly whenever we're training. So when we're training, especially protection, maybe not so much tracking and some light obedience, but when we're training a lot of protection, I make sure to do it about 4 times a week, sometimes even more. You'll see me out in the hotel parking lot with my van open, just giving my dog a massage. Now, I say that because the pre-cooling methods, the day of pre-cooling methods, could have a potential to make your dog pull a muscle. So it's really important that they're really loose. I always put an emphasis on making sure my dog can sleep in an area where they can stretch, so not a little crate. I do this because athletes do it. There's no athlete that curls up in a tiny box, and there's obvious reasons for that. You can't stretch, your muscles are gonna get tighter. So for a dog, he's my athlete. I'm gonna look at what the top athletes are doing to preserve their body, and I'm gonna try to emulate that because I figure they have access to all the professionals and I don't. The pre-cooling method I'm talking about is going to be water submersion or ice water submersion. Largely the most effective way in all the research I've read to reduce the effects of heat, particularly for more short-term events like a track meet. Not so much for marathons, which are 4.5 hours or more, but for events that are shorter, in length of time, the ice submersion or cold water submersion prior to the event is extremely effective. Really big research coming out showing that athletes have an edge when they pre-cool in temperatures like what we saw in Tokyo in 2020 for the Olympics. And again in, I think it was Brazil, and there was another one in Australia that I read. So watching these athletes and how they prepare for these temperatures is something that I've paid a lot of attention to, because we don't want to be in a situation where our dog can't show their best because they are struggling with the heat. And as we know, dogs are dawn and dusk animals. You don't see coyotes and wolves out hunting in the middle of the day. They're just really not designed for it. Their temperature's quite high for that. So when we ask the dogs to do these things, we can assume that they're not going to do it at their best if they're really hot. So let's talk about exactly what that pre-cooling is. When I travel somewhere, I've got a few items I want to pick up. One is going to be a plastic trash can. It can be as big or as small as you want it. I usually try to get a bigger one, like a kitchen kind of trash can. And I want to get about 5 gallons of water. So just the single gallon ones you can usually get at any store in any country. I want to get 5 gallons of water, and then I want to get a pitcher. Now, day of the event, and I want to scout this out prior. I want to scout out where the stores are, or the gas stations are, because in a lot of different countries, not all gas stations sell ice. So I want to know where those gas stations are and if they have a full supply, because the morning of the competition or the afternoon, let's say if I have a 3 o'clock showing and it's 85 degrees, I want to know that I can hit that gas station and that I have a backup gas station or store where I can buy a couple bags of ice. I usually only use 1 bag of ice, but I get 2 because it helps preserve the ice a little bit better. And you know, you're competing, so you're a little cuckoo and crazy. So you just do everything extra. So you want to get a pitcher, and that pitcher is going to be so that when you start the pre-cooling of your dog, you're going to be pouring water into the the garbage can, and then you're going to dump a half a bag of ice or a whole bag of ice. Generally, you don't need a lot. You just want that water really, really cold. And you're going to start with the pitcher. The most important parts are going to be under the belly, the underarms, the legs, all the areas that have short hair. That's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with the the belly, the balls, the butt. Anywhere that doesn't have hair, I'm going to be pouring as much water, and full submersion is fine too. If your competition has a hose, you can definitely use that, and I've used that in lieu of ice because it's just easier. It's right there. So what I like to do is start about 30 minutes before I go on. And guys, this is primarily for protection. For obedience, depending on your dog, if your dog's already jacked up, this can be a little bit of a problem if you take their temperature down. But for protection, we want as much of that emotion, so it only helps us. So we want to be submerging the dog in cold water as much as possible. And then I'm going to put my dog back into the crate in an air-conditioned, blasting car with towels, something that can absorb some of that water so he's not super uncomfortable. I use these cushy, absorbent pads generally, but something that's going to kind of absorb a little bit of that water so they're not standing on plastic. You don't want them, super uncomfortable right before you go out. And then I might do it again 15 minutes before I go on. And I might do it again right before I go on, certainly right before I go on. So depending on how extreme the heat is, you can kind of play with that. But what we're looking to do is take the temperature down a little bit, or at least take the skin temperature down. Now, I know that we've had lots of people telling us that, oh, you don't want to ever go from cold to hot because the dog is going to be the disparity between the temperatures is going to make the dog like, oh, the heat. That's just not true. I know it seems like it makes sense, but first of all, it's not what the professionals are doing. So we know that when somebody's preparing for the freaking Olympics, they're going to do exactly what all the research has shown. So when you go into a competition already hot, you are operating at a deficit. When I was doing my track at FCI, I was watching dogs who were already with their mouth open, panting, coming up to the flag. You can't tell me a dog's going to be able to do an IGP3 track when they're already, gassed and they're already really, really hot. So taking down the temperature gives you time. It gives you a lot of time before that temperature builds back up. And I'll just say this, take an ice bath, just do a minute, just Put yourself a minute in cold water and then go out into 90-degree heat. It feels so good. And I learned this when I was running a lot in Southern California. I hosed down before and I felt great. My runs were better. It made me more mentally excited to do it. But if I was already super hot and then now trying to go for a 2-hour run, it was mentally didn't feel so great, but also physically it was a lot. So yes, the dog is gonna have an advantage if they're used to the heat, if they're used to working in the heat, but that does not mean that you wanna take them from the heat to the heat. That's just not what the research has shown. The other thing I wanna talk about right now is sleep. Sleep in the athlete world is the creme de la creme. It's something that's of golden importance. So when I am letting my dog rest, one of the most important things is that he rests restfully. And that for him and for people means resting in a temperature that's cool. We don't sleep well in heated areas, and neither do they. You can hear them when it's hot. They're up all night, they're panting. So while the acclimation is a great factor, we want to make sure that they're also sleeping really well too. And for me, that means my dog, if you're in 85-degree temperatures, it means they're in an air-conditioned area at night, getting as good of a rest as possible. Now for tracking, you might alter this a little bit. It maybe doesn't have to be extreme because the energy output is so different with protection versus tracking, but I'm still going to be really careful. I'm going to bring an umbrella and I'm going to make sure to train with an umbrella. We'll talk more about all the training with this in a second, but I'm going to bring an umbrella to make sure my dog stays shaded from the time he exits the car to the flag. And I'm going to bring a small bottle of ice water so that I can give him one final splash under the belly and even a couple laps of water if he wants it. All of this has to be trained first. That's the most important thing. And you'll see that if you read these links that show you where a lot of this information came from, you'll read over and over that the athlete must be using these practices or techniques prior to the event to make sure they troubleshoot anything and to make sure they're used to it. With the dog is even more important because they don't speak English. We can't tell them why we're doing this. So we need to make sure that, if you give your dog a drink of water right before tracking, are they going to be coughing the whole time? I don't know your dog. For my dog, it works really well. He drinks his water. He might even cough after he drinks it a little bit, but then he goes out there and he can do that full track without ever opening his mouth. So practice all of these things prior. You don't have to do them every single time, certainly not, but make sure you have, first of all, a map in your head of exactly how it's gonna go, and that your dog has seen that picture, has had that feeling, and is totally comfortable with it. Again, don't forget the most important thing when you are prepping for the heat is to get your dog out and work them in the heat in a staggered way at first. So being sure not to do too much too soon. Heat exposure does damage to the body. So even after you push real hard in the heat, try to put them in some water to cool them off and reduce any damage. That may slow down your acclimation just a little bit, but as long as you have the time to put into that acclimation, it's gonna be a little bit safer than letting that heat continue to damage the body as it does, and you can read about in these studies. Okay guys, I hope this helped you, and I hope you go into some of these competitions with a lot more confidence, knowing that you're doing right by your dog and that your dog is gonna show the best that they are able to do and not be inhibited by temperature.
Black on black on black on black on black on black on black. You don't have to ball a rap to get them racks on racks. Uber poolers trying to catch my vibe and find my way. Yeah, I know I'm ratchet, but I'm really safe. Hot sauce dripping. Everybody wanna start dipping. First nobody wanna listen. Now everybody pay attention. Now everybody pay a fee. Even Trump gotta take a knee. When the horn blow, y'all gon' see. Make the wall fall down like yee. I don't do the most, but I do a lot. I'ma make a toast, cause we still alive. No big, I feel like Pac. I shoot the shot. I'm coming in hot.